I live in California, so it's hard to find newspapers that aren't only talking about Trump and the weather. So I work hard for you guys. Hey, my name is Damon Garcia. Welcome to Newspaper Liturgy, and today we're talking about the discernment needed in all these protests, riots, and marches. Okay, let's get into this. So March 4th, there was a march for Trump. So clever. Actually, one of my friends posted on that day, "Why aren't there any marches today? It's March 4. You have such a great opportunity." And it happened to be Trump supporters. From Colorado's state capitol to Trump's tower in New York and the Washington Monument, groups of hundreds of people rallied for President Trump Saturday, waving "Deplorables for Trump" signs and even carrying a life-size cutout of the president. Supporters clashed with generally smaller groups of counter-protesters. So now we're having protests and protests against the protests. Soon enough, we're probably going to have protests against protests against protests. Am I right? 6 people protesting the rally in St. Paul, Minnesota were arrested on felony riot charges after they lit fireworks inside the Minnesota state capitol and fled, police said. Some other minor scuffles between the dueling demonstrators were quickly diffused. The dueling demonstrators. I love this.
Dueling demonstrators.
I love this. Chelsea Thomas, an accountant from Thornton, Colorado, brought her family to the rally and a life-size cardboard cutout of Trump. She said the family has taken it with them on camping trips, boat rides, and a country music festival. "It's nice to be surrounded by people who share your morals and opinions," said Thomas, as her son walked back and forth across the grass with a Trump flag. A group of counter-protesters gathered nearby, separated from the rally by police tape. They chanted, "No Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA," and held signs with messages like, "Your vote was a hate crime." Jeez. Okay, so let's talk about all these protests, marches, riots going on everywhere. And it's difficult because so many people feel misrepresented and overlooked and uncared for. And it's pretty difficult these days to voice your protest to something that you think is unjust, something that you think is leading this country in a bad direction. Especially when people on the other side of your argument, no matter what it is, tend to just say, "Get over it." And it's hard to know, what can I do to make this point? If you go out on the streets and try to protest, you might just be seen as a criminal who just wants to destroy things. If you do it on the internet, then you might just be seen as the super annoying guy that keeps showing up in people's feeds that they want to get rid of. If you take a knee during the Pledge of Allegiance, all patriot hell breaks loose. All sides of every argument are trying to find a way to get their points across that they feel genuinely needs to be said, and the opposite sides are saying, "Get over it, just quit it, just shut up." And that's how we get into a cycle of protests and protests on protests on protests. Protests and protests on protests and protests on protests and protests on protests and protests on protests on protests. Before we go any further, I want to read 2 stories in the Bible about 2 riots. The first one is a riot from Jesus himself. In Mark 11, "Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.' And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city." Now this is a very famous story of Jesus coming into the temple and turning over tables and just generally causing a ruckus. Because the temple was where people came to worship their God and to offer sacrifices to their God. And people came in and made it a place for them to make money off this. And seeing all this corruption, Jesus totally lost his cool and rioted. And usually when we hear this story, or when people tell this story, it's kind of told as if he came in, flipped some tables, said this is messed up, and then walked out. But I think this event probably lasted a few hours, because it said after he was flipping tables, He said he wouldn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. So he must have spent time stopping people and just interrupting everything, because the temple is huge. And it said, and he was teaching and saying, and then we get that quote. So he must have been saying all kinds of other stuff too. And then the end says, and then when evening came. So I just imagine Jesus coming in, flipping tables, shouting things, protesting, calling people out for their corruption until evening. Now that's a Jesus we don't usually talk about. And some perspectives say that this was the key event that got him killed, because he's causing huge disruptions in the corrupt system that are keeping the powerful powerful and the powerless powerless. So when it comes to protesting and fighting for justice and against oppression, I believe there is a place for that within the spiritual life, because we see Jesus do it himself. That doesn't mean necessarily we're called to go into every government building and start flipping tables. Of course not. Rather, I think we should strive to have the heart of Jesus that he had when he was doing this. The absolute relentless empathy for the needy and the powerless and those who are being stepped on. The righteous anger against injustice and corruption and the desire to do something about it. And I think that something looks different for everyone. Some people are great on getting out in public and protesting their message in a rational, safe way. Some people are great at writing letters to government officials to get something done. Some people are great at having good, healthy conversation with the other side that unites people. Some people are great at discussing policy and explaining it to others to get them to vote in a way that helps everyone. And some people need to shut up. Now let's zoom out here and talk about the dangerous rioting in association with these protests. There was a dangerous protest riot in the book of Acts. So in this event in Acts, Paul and his companions are going around the city of Ephesus talking about Jesus and that he's the one true God, and implying that all their handmade idols are false and they need to be thrown out. Which makes the artisans and the silversmiths angry, because he's running them out of business if they don't have to make idols anymore. So one of the silversmiths named Demetrius, who makes silver shrines for the goddess Artemis, gathers people together and says, these people are dangerous, we need to dispute them. And we can't let them scorn the goddess Artemis. She can't be deprived of her majesty. And I really feel like Demetrius probably doesn't care all that much about Artemis. I think he just wants to keep making money. So he's like, people, come on, we can't forget about Artemis. And then it says, when they heard this, they were enraged and shouted, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. People chanted back then too. The city was filled with the confusion, and people rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's traveling companions. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province of Asia who were friendly to him sent him a message urging him not to venture into the theater. Paul's wanting to go in there and defend himself and make sense of all this. They're like, no, it's getting too crazy. Trust me. Meanwhile, some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. They didn't know why they had come together. Most of them were like, yeah, they had no idea why they were there. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward, and Alexander motioned for silence and tried to make a defense before the people. People were like, this guy probably knows what he's talking about, let's push him up there. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, all of them shouted in unison, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. They're like, oh snap, he's one of them, get him out of here. And they chant for 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. But when the town clerk had quietened the crowd, he said, citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You have brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the artisans with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges there against one another. If there is anything further you want to know, it must be settled in the regular assembly, for we are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. When he said this, he dismissed the assembly. Now let's talk about the differences between these two riots. It's interesting how with Jesus, he just goes for it and causes this commotion. And yet in this story, the wisdom is calm down. If these people have a complaint with these people, let them take it to court. Let them settle it in the regular assembly. We can't justify all this craziness right now. And that's what's really difficult when we talk about these protests, is that many people can't separate the people who have this compassionate heart for justice and against oppression and are trying to make a difference. They can't separate them from the people who have no idea why they're even there and just want to destroy something. In so many of these protests, it starts with this group who wants to make a difference, and then people just see them going and they're like, yeah, let's do this. Yeah, I think Black Lives Matter too. Let me set this police car on fire. Or in the story we read earlier, they set fireworks off inside. Some people in this world just want a reason to yell at men in suits, and they join whatever movement they think will allow them to do that. So we can't really say that these violent property destroyers are the movement that they're yelling. In the same way that we can't say that the Nazis and the KKK members represent the movement that they attach themselves to, particularly the movement of Trump supporters. So we all just need to approach these things with wisdom. We need to be wise about the way we critique certain movements, stop overgeneralizing and say that all of them feel this way if they're a part of this movement. Try to understand how certain people could get to a place where they feel like the only way my voice could be heard is if I join this movement or if I join this protest. And lastly, before you go fight for something or against something, try to understand the thing you're talking about. Don't be like those people in Acts who just shouted things a part of a crowd and had no idea why they were really there. You're actually just messing things up for the people you think you're helping. You're making it harder for real change to happen. So be wise. Have a discernment out there, guys. And let's keep building that empathy. See you later.
Lady, buddy, gent, oh please.